Chapter 1. The Thunder That Wasn't Thunder. The summer of 1947 stretched across New Mexico like a painted canvas of endless blue sky and golden desert. The air shimmered with heat waves that danced above the sagebrush, creating mirages that fooled the eye and played tricks on reality itself. In this vast expanse of high desert, where the horizon seems to touch infinity, something was about to happen that would change everything. July 2nd, 1947. The evening sky over Roswell was clear as crystal, dotted with the first tentative stars of twilight. Ranch foreman William Mac Brazel was making his usual rounds across the Foster Ranch, 75 miles northwest of the small desert town. The silence was profound, the kind of silence that makes you aware of your own heartbeat. Then came the sound. Not thunder, though it rolled across the desert like thunder. Not lightning, though the sky briefly flickered with an otherworldly light. Mac had lived in New Mexico his entire life, had witnessed countless desert storms, but this was different. The sound came from above, a deep rumbling that seemed to shake the very molecules of air. Mac stopped his horse and looked up, scanning the darkening sky. For just a moment he thought he saw something. A streak of light that didn't behave like any meteor he'd ever seen. It moved too slowly, too deliberately. The next morning brought a discovery that would haunt Mac Brazel for the rest of his life. Scattered across a 3/4-mile stretch of his ranch lay debris unlike anything he'd ever encountered. The material was strange, almost impossible to describe. Some pieces looked like metallic foil, but when crumpled, they would return to their original shape with an eerie, silent precision. There were I-beams, but not like any I-beams from this world. These bore markings, symbols that looked almost like hieroglyphics, etched into metal that seemed impossibly light yet incredibly strong. Mac picked up a piece, turned it over in his weathered hands. The surface was smooth, almost liquid in appearance, yet completely solid to the touch. When he tried to cut it with his knife, the blade left no mark. When he tried to burn it with his lighter, the flame had no effect whatsoever. The silence of the desert suddenly felt different, heavier, as if the land itself was holding its breath. What Mac Brazel didn't know, as he stood there in the morning sun examining these impossible fragments, was that his discovery would soon attract the attention of the most powerful military force in the world. He didn't know that within days, his quiet ranch would become ground zero for what might be the most significant cover-up in human history. He simply knew that something had fallen from the sky, something that shouldn't exist. As the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the debris field, Mac made a decision that would echo through decades. He would drive into Roswell and report what he'd found. It seemed like the right thing to do, the responsible thing. He had no way of knowing that this simple act of civic duty would set in motion a chain of events that would involve presidential orders, military intimidation, and a wall of secrecy that remains unbroken to this day. The desert wind picked up, scattering dust across the strange metallic fragments. In that wind, you could almost hear whispers of the future, of congressional hearings and conspiracy theories, of believers and skeptics, of truth buried beneath layers of classified documents. But for now, in this moment frozen in time, there was only Mac Brazel, a scattered debris field, and the vast New Mexico sky that had delivered its secrets to the earth below. The countdown to revelation had begun, and somewhere in the corridors of power, decisions were already being made about what the world would, and would not, be allowed to know. Chapter 2. The Major's Dilemma. Major Jesse Marcel had seen war. He'd witnessed the impossible geometry of bombed cities, the twisted metal of crashed aircraft, the debris of human conflict scattered across foreign landscapes. But standing in the back of Mac Brazel's pickup truck on that scorching July afternoon, examining the fragments spread across the ranch, Marcel felt something he'd never experienced before. Wonder, mixed with an unsettling kind of fear. Marcel was the intelligence officer at Roswell Army Airfield, the most advanced military installation in the world at that time. This was the base that housed the 509th Composite Group, the only atomic bomb wing in existence. These men had ended a world war. They were accustomed to secrets, to technology that pushed the boundaries of possibility. But this was beyond anything in their playbook. "What do you make of it, Major?" Brazel asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Marcel picked up one of the I-beam fragments, feeling its impossible lightness. The metal, if it was metal, seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The hieroglyphic-like markings appeared to shift and change, depending on the angle of view, as if they existed in dimensions beyond the normal three. "I honestly don't know, Mac," Marcel replied, and those words felt strange in his mouth. In his world, intelligence officers were supposed to know. They were supposed to have answers, classifications, explanations. They were supposed to make sense of the senseless. As Marcel loaded the debris into military vehicles, his mind raced through possibilities. Weather balloon? No, he'd seen thousands of weather balloons. Experimental aircraft? He was cleared for every black project the military had running. This matched nothing in the classified files. The drive back to Roswell Army Airfield passed in contemplative silence. Marcel found himself glancing repeatedly in the rearview mirror at the covered truck bed behind him, as if expecting the debris to somehow disappear, to prove itself a mirage born of desert heat and imagination. But it remained stubbornly, impossibly real. Back at the base, Marcel made another decision that would reverberate through history. Before reporting to his commanding officer, he stopped at home. His wife and young son were waiting, curious about his extended absence. "You have to see this," Marcel told them, his voice carrying an excitement that was almost childlike. In the quiet of his living room, far from military protocols and classification stamps, Marcel spread some of the smaller fragments across the carpet. His 11-year-old son, Jesse Jr., knelt beside the pieces, his eyes wide with wonder. "It's not from this world, is it, Dad?" the boy asked with the startling directness of childhood. Marcel paused. In that moment, surrounded by his family, holding materials that defied every law of physics he understood, he felt the weight of something larger than military duty, larger than national security, larger than the carefully constructed world of secrets and clearances that defined his professional life. "No, son," he said quietly. "I don't think it is." The photograph was taken that night. Major Marcel kneeling beside the debris, his uniform crisp, his expression serious, yet somehow wondering. It would become one of the most analyzed images in UFO lore, scrutinized by believers and debunkers for decades to come. But in that moment, it was simply a father sharing something extraordinary with his family. The next morning brought a harsh return to military reality. Colonel William Blanchard, base commander, examined the debris with the cold efficiency of a career officer. Phone calls were made to higher authorities. Orders came down through classified channels. The official story was crafted with military precision. It was a weather balloon, a classified weather balloon, part of Project Mogul, designed to detect Soviet nuclear tests. The debris was nothing more than radar reflectors and meteorological equipment. Marcel watched as the real debris was loaded into a B-29 and flown to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio. In its place, the remains of an actual weather balloon were arranged for a second photograph, this one destined for newspapers across the country. In this new photograph, Marcel knelt beside obvious balloon materials, his expression carefully neutral. But those who knew him well could see something different in his eyes. A kind of sadness, perhaps. The look of a man who had touched something extraordinary and watched it disappear into the machinery of official denial. Years later, Marcel would break his silence. He would tell anyone willing to listen that what he found in the desert that July morning was not of this world. He would describe materials that possessed properties beyond current human technology. He would speak of a cover-up that reached the highest levels of government. But by then, the official story was set in concrete. The weather balloon explanation had become historical fact, repeated in textbooks and encyclopedias, filed away in the archives of accepted truth. The real truth, according to Marcel, flew away to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, and vanished into the black world of classified research and development. In the New Mexico desert, the wind continued to blow across the Foster Ranch, erasing the last traces of that extraordinary night. But the questions Marcel carried with him to his grave remained suspended in the air like heat mirages, shimmering just beyond the reach of certainty. What happened to those impossible fragments? What did the military really find in the desert that summer? And why, decades later, do the deepest vaults of Wright-Patterson Air Base remain sealed to public scrutiny? The answers, if they exist, rest in shadows darker than the New Mexico night. Chapter 3. The General's Secret. In the summer of 1947, Brigadier General Roger Ramey stood at the center of what would become the most enduring mystery of the modern age. As commander of the 8th Air Force at Fort Worth Army Airfield, Ramey was no stranger to sensitive situations. But nothing in his distinguished military career had prepared him for the phone call that came from Washington on the morning of July 8th. The voice on the other end of the secure line was clipped, authoritative, and carried the weight of presidential authority. "General, you have materials coming your way from Roswell. These materials are to be classified at the highest level. Do you understand?" Ramey understood. In the military hierarchy of 1947, when Washington spoke with that tone, you listened, you followed orders, you asked no questions. But understanding and accepting are two different things entirely. When the B-29 from Roswell touched down at Fort Worth, Ramey was waiting on the tarmac. The sight that greeted him challenged everything he thought he knew about the possible. The debris wasn't just unusual, it was impossible. Materials that seemed to exist outside the known laws of physics. Metal that couldn't be cut, burned, or even scratched. Fragments that weighed almost nothing yet possessed incredible strength. Ramey picked up one of the I-beams, turning it slowly in the Texas sunlight. The hieroglyphic markings seemed to pulse with their own inner light. The surface felt cool despite the blazing summer heat, and when he tapped it with his knuckle, it produced no sound whatsoever. For a moment that stretched toward eternity, General Ramey allowed himself to consider the implications. If this material was genuine, if it truly came from somewhere beyond Earth, then everything humanity believed about its place in the universe would have to change. The isolation would be over. The questions that had haunted philosophers and scientists for centuries would be answered. We are not alone. But that moment of wonder was brief. The phone rang again. "General, the press conference is scheduled for 1600 hours. You know what needs to be done." By late afternoon, the press room at Fort Worth Army Airfield was packed with reporters from across Texas and beyond. Word had leaked about something extraordinary happening in New Mexico, and the media scented a story. Flashbulbs popped like small lightning strikes as General Ramey entered the room. But the debris spread across the floor bore no resemblance to what had arrived from Roswell. In its place lay the obvious remains of a weather balloon, twisted aluminum radar reflectors, torn rubber, mundane meteorological equipment. Ramey's performance was masterful. With the practiced ease of a career military officer, he explained that the Roswell incident was nothing more than a case of mistaken identity. An experimental weather balloon had crashed. Its unfamiliar configuration had confused local personnel, and the whole affair had been blown out of proportion. The reporters scribbled notes, snapped photographs, and filed their stories. By the next morning, newspapers across the country carried headlines about the flying disc that turned out to be a weather balloon. The story was dead, buried beneath the weight of official explanation and military authority. But where did the real debris go? According to witnesses who would speak only decades later, the genuine materials were loaded onto another aircraft that same evening. The destination was Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio, specifically Hangar 18, a facility that officially didn't exist on any base directory. Wright-Patterson was already home to the military's most advanced research and development programs. It was there that captured German technology was being reverse-engineered, where the future of American aviation was taking shape in classified laboratories and workshop. Now it would also house materials from an entirely different kind of source. The legend of Hangar 18 would grow in the shadows of official denial. Whispered stories spoke of scientists working around the clock to understand the impossible debris. Reports surfaced of breakthrough technologies that seemed to leap decades ahead of normal development cycles. Patents were filed for materials science advances that seemed to come from nowhere. But these were only whispers, rumors, the kind of stories that flourish in the absence of official information. General Ramey never spoke publicly about what really happened during those crucial hours in July 1947. He carried the secret with him through the remainder of his distinguished career, through his retirement, and finally to his grave. But those who served with him noted changes in the man after that summer. He became more contemplative, more prone to staring at the night sky. He developed an interest in astronomy that hadn't been there before, and sometimes, late at night in the officers' club, after a few drinks had loosened tongues and lowered guards, he would ask questions that seemed to come from nowhere. "Do you ever wonder if we're alone out here?" he might ask, gesturing toward the window and the stars beyond. "Do you ever think about what we'd do if we weren't?" The questions hung in the air like smoke, unanswered and perhaps unanswerable. Years later, researchers digging through declassified documents would discover something interesting about the weather balloon explanation. Project Mogul, the classified program that supposedly accounted for the Roswell debris, had indeed been operating in New Mexico in 1947, but Flight No. 4, launched on June 4th of that year, was the closest any Mogul balloon had come to the crash site. Flight No. 4 had been launched more than 85 miles away. It had been tracked throughout its entire flight path. It had been recovered intact. The official explanation, crafted with such care and delivered with such authority, didn't quite fit the facts. But by then, the truth had long since disappeared into the shadows of Hangar 18, leaving behind only questions and the persistent feeling that humanity was not being told the whole story about what fell from the sky that summer night in New Mexico. The stars continued to shine above Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, keeping their ancient secrets locked in the darkness between their distant lights. Chapter 4. The Witnesses Who Vanished. In the days following the crash, Roswell buzzed with whispered conversations and nervous glances. People had seen things. People had heard things. People had stories to tell, stories that didn't match the official weather balloon narrative that was already hardening into accepted fact. But one by one, those people began to disappear from the story. Not literally vanished. That would have been too obvious, too dramatic for the careful choreography of official denial. Instead, they faded away through more subtle means. Transfers to distant military bases, sudden career changes, conversations that ended abruptly when certain subjects were raised. The message was clear without ever being spoken. Some stories are not meant to be told. Glenn Dennis was a young mortician at Ballard Funeral Home in Roswell. In 1947, his establishment held a contract with the Army base to provide mortuary services when needed. On July 5th, 3 days after the crash, Dennis received a phone call that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The voice on the other end was official, military, direct. "We need to know if you have any hermetically sealed children's coffins, small ones. And we need information about preservation techniques for bodies that have been exposed to the elements." Dennis was puzzled but professional. Such requests weren't entirely unusual. Military accidents happened, sometimes in remote locations where recovery was delayed. But when he offered to deliver the coffins personally, the caller became evasive. "That won't be necessary. We'll contact you if we need them." Later that evening, driven by curiosity and professional concern, Dennis drove out to the base. He had a legitimate reason, a scheduled pickup of medical supplies, but his real motivation was the strange phone call. At the base hospital, Dennis encountered unusual activity. Military personnel were moving about with urgent purpose. The loading dock was crowded with vehicles and personnel, far more activity than normal for a quiet summer evening. It was there that Dennis claims to have encountered Nurse Lieutenant Patricia Naomi Self, a young officer he'd met at various social functions around town. She appeared shaken, almost frightened, and when she saw Dennis, she quickly pulled him aside. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered, glancing around nervously. "They brought in some bodies earlier, strange bodies, not human." According to Dennis, Nurse Self described creatures unlike anything in medical textbooks. small humanoid figures with enlarged heads and unusual physiological characteristics. The bodies were badly decomposed from days in the desert heat, filling the examination room with an otherworldly stench that penetrated even medical masks. The smell, she told him, was like nothing I've ever encountered, sweet and metallic, but wrong somehow. Everything about them was wrong. Dennis tried to get more information, but before Nurse Self could elaborate, military police arrived. Dennis was escorted from the base with a warning that was polite but unmistakable. He was not to discuss what he had seen or heard. His mortuary contract with the base could easily be terminated if discretion was not maintained. The next day, Dennis tried to contact Nurse Self at the base. He was told she had been transferred. No forwarding information was available. It was as if she had simply disappeared from the official records. Years later, researchers attempting to verify Dennis's account would discover that no nurse by the name of Patricia Self, or any similar variation, appeared on the base personnel records for 1947. Either Dennis had remembered the name incorrectly, or the records themselves had been sanitized. Military personnel faced even more direct pressure to remain silent. Staff Sergeant Lewis, Bill Rickett, was part of the Counterintelligence Corps at Roswell Army Airfield. His job was security, discretion, the protection of sensitive information. But what he encountered in July 1947 tested the limits of his professional training. Rickett was part of the military team that accompanied Major Marcel to the crash site. He saw the debris field, handled the impossible materials, witnessed the careful collection and cataloging of every fragment. It wasn't from this world, Rickett would later tell researchers, decades after his retirement. The stuff we found out there, it just wasn't made by human hands. But in 1947, Rickett's superiors made it clear that certain subjects were not to be discussed, not with family, not with friends, not with anyone lacking appropriate security clearance. The briefing was informal but absolute. Careers could be destroyed, security clearances could be revoked, court-martials could be convened. The peacetime military of 1947 was still small enough, insular enough, that a single black mark could end a promising career before it began. Most of the military witnesses chose silence. But silence, it turned out, was not always enough. Technical Sergeant Homer Rolette worked in the base photo lab. His job was developing and processing military photography, a position that required the highest security clearances and absolute discretion. In the days following the Roswell incident, Rolette processed photographs that challenged everything he thought he knew about the limits of the possible. According to later testimony, the photographs showed not just debris, but bodies. Small humanoid forms that bore no resemblance to any earthly creature. The images were sharp, clinical, undeniably real. Rolette developed the photographs, made the required number of prints, and filed them according to standard security protocols. He mentioned the unusual nature of the images to no one. Not his wife, not his colleagues, not his closest friends. But in 1952, 5 years after the incident, Rolette died suddenly of a heart attack. He was 32 years old, with no previous history of cardiac problems. His widow, attempting to sort through his military records and personal papers, discovered that all documentation related to his work at Roswell had been removed. His security clearances, his duty assignments, his performance evaluations. Everything from his time at the base was missing from his personnel file. It was as if those years had been erased from official memory. The pattern repeated itself across dozens of witnesses: sudden transfers, early retirements, missing records, and in a few cases, untimely deaths that removed inconvenient voices from the historical record. By 1950, less than 3 years after the incident, almost all of the military personnel who had direct knowledge of the Roswell events had been scattered to the winds. Some went to overseas assignments. Others found themselves stationed at remote bases far from their families and support networks. The few who remained in New Mexico learned to speak carefully, to avoid certain subjects, to change the topic when conversations drifted toward that strange summer of 1947. The message had been received and understood. Some secrets are too important to trust to individual conscience. In the vast bureaucracy of the American military-industrial complex, truth became a luxury that few could afford. Official reality was safer, more predictable, more manageable than the alternative. And so the witnesses vanished, one by one, into the machinery of classified anonymity, carrying their impossible memories into forced silence. The desert wind continued to blow across the crash site, erasing the last physical traces of that extraordinary night. But the questions raised by those scattered witnesses remained, suspended in the air like dust motes in sunlight, visible when the light hit them just right, but impossible to grasp. What did they really see in the New Mexico desert? And why was their silence worth more than their truth? Chapter 5. The Photographer's Last Role. In the digital age, we take photographs casually, thoughtlessly, thousands of images stored in devices that fit in our pocket. But in 1947, photography was different. Film was expensive. Each shot was considered, composed, precious. When you pressed the shutter, it meant something. Which makes the story of Jacques Vallée's mysterious photographer all the more compelling. Vallée, the French-born astronomer and computer scientist who had become one of the most respected UFO researchers in the world, spent decades collecting first-hand accounts from military personnel who had been stationed at Roswell Army Airfield. In the 1960s, nearly 20 years after the incident, one of those accounts would haunt him for the rest of his career. The witness was a former military photographer who had served at the base in 1947. He had contacted Vallée through intermediaries, reluctant to speak but apparently compelled by something stronger than fear. They met at a small cafe in Albuquerque, far from both Roswell and the photographer's current home. "I need to tell someone," the man said, his hands shaking slightly as he lit a cigarette. "I've carried this for 20 years, and it's eating me alive." The photographer, Vallée, never revealed his name, referring to him only as Source A, had been assigned to document the debris recovery operation. His orders were simple: photograph everything. Create a complete visual record, standard military procedure for unusual incidents. But what he captured on film was anything but standard. The first photographs were of the debris field itself, the scattered fragments that defied easy classification, the I-beams with their hieroglyphic markings, the metallic foil that couldn't be torn or burned. These images, according to the photographer, were remarkably clear, showing details that would have been invaluable to material scientists and engineers. But then came the photographs that changed everything. They brought in bodies, the photographer told Vallée, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Not human bodies, something else entirely. According to Source A, the entities were small, perhaps 4 feet tall, with proportionally large heads and delicate limbs. Their skin had a grayish cast, possibly due to exposure to the desert elements, but the anatomical structure was clearly non-human. The photographer had documented everything with clinical precision. Close-ups of the unusual cranial structure, full-body shots showing the proportional differences from human anatomy, detailed photographs of hands that possessed 4 fingers instead of 5, with what appeared to be sucker-like appendages at the fingertips. "I shot 6 rolls of film," he told Vallée, 144 photographs total, the most important pictures ever taken, and nobody will ever see them. The developed photographs were classified at the highest levels and immediately transferred to Washington. But before they were shipped east, the photographer had managed to retain a few frames from the final roll, images he had hidden in his personal equipment. These photographs, he claimed, provided undeniable proof that the Roswell incident involved something far more significant than weather balloons or experimental aircraft. They were, in his words, evidence that would change the world. But the photographer never showed these images to Vallée. "I wanted to," he said, stubbing out his cigarette with more force than necessary. "God knows I wanted to, but they're gone." The story he told was both familiar and chilling. In the weeks following the incident, military personnel began receiving visits from intelligence officers. These weren't the usual security briefings. They were intensive, personal interrogations designed to identify anyone who might possess unauthorized materials or information. The photographer's quarters were searched, His personal equipment was confiscated and examined. When the hidden photographs were discovered, the consequences were swift and severe. "They didn't threaten me directly," he told Valet. "They didn't have to. They just explained how security breaches could affect my family, my wife's civilian job at the bank, my son's college applications, my father's veterans benefits." The hidden photographs were destroyed in front of him, not just confiscated, destroyed, burned to ash in a metal wastebasket while he watched. But the photographer had retained something else. The negatives from one roll of film, hidden in a place the searchers never thought to look. "I kept them for years," he said. "Hidden in my garage, wrapped in oilcloth, buried in a coffee can. I told myself I was preserving history, that someday the world would be ready for the truth. But fear, it turned out, was stronger than duty to history." In 1965, 18 years after the incident, the photographer had finally retrieved the hidden negatives. He developed them privately, in a dark room he'd constructed in his basement. The images that emerged were everything he remembered, clear, undeniable evidence of something extraordinary. For 3 days he stared at those photographs, wrestling with his conscience. Should he release them to the press? Contact a researcher like Valet? Find some way to get the truth to the public? On the 4th day, he burned the negatives and destroyed the prints. "I couldn't do it to my family," he told Valet, tears visible in his eyes. "My wife had already suffered enough from the whispers and suspicions. My son was just starting his own military career. I couldn't be the man who brought that kind of attention down on them." Valet pressed for more details, for anything that might corroborate the photographer's account, but the man had clearly reached the limit of what he was willing to share. "I needed to tell someone," he said as they prepared to leave the cafe. "I needed one person to know that the photographs existed, that the proof was real. But they're gone now. It's better that way." Valet never saw the photographer again. Attempts to contact him through the original intermediaries were unsuccessful. It was as if the man had simply disappeared back into the anonymity of civilian life. But Valet was left with questions that would drive his research for decades to come. If the photographer's account was genuine, then somewhere in the classified archives of the military establishment lay photographic evidence that could transform humanity's understanding of its place in the universe. Were those photographs still hidden in the deepest vaults of Wright-Patterson Air Force Base? Had they been destroyed to prevent any possibility of unauthorized disclosure? Or had they been shared with a select few, a secret brotherhood of military and civilian leaders who possess knowledge too dangerous for public consumption? The photographer's story remained one of many tantalizing glimpses into a truth that seemed always to hover just beyond reach. Like a photograph exposed to light for too long, the details remained visible but somehow faded, real but not quite provable. In the end, perhaps that was the most effective form of cover-up, not the dramatic destruction of evidence, but its gradual dissolution into uncertainty and doubt. The truth, like those hidden negatives, remained buried somewhere in the darkness, waiting for someone brave enough to bring it into the light. Chapter 6. The General's Deathbed Confession, November 1997. 50 years after Roswell, retired Brigadier General Arthur Exon lay in a hospital bed in Ohio, his body failing but his mind still sharp as desert air. The man who had commanded Wright-Patterson Air Force Base during some of its most secretive years was finally ready to talk. The confession came in whispers, delivered to a small group of UFO researchers who had managed to gain access during his final weeks. Among them was Dr. Kevin Randall, a former military intelligence officer turned investigator, whose credentials had earned him a place at the dying general's bedside. "I was there," Exon said, his voice barely audible above the hum of medical equipment. "I saw what they brought from Roswell, and I helped bury it." Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in 1947 was the crown jewel of American military research. Known officially as the Air Materiel Command, it was where captured German technology was being reverse-engineered, where the future of American aviation was taking shape in classified laboratories and workshops. It was also where the debris from Roswell had been taken for analysis. Exon had been a lieutenant colonel at the time, working in the base's most sensitive research divisions. His security clearance was among the highest in the military, granting him access to projects that wouldn't see daylight for decades. But nothing had prepared him for what arrived from New Mexico in July 1947. The material came in on a special transport, Exxon told the researchers. Not regular cargo, not routine. This was something different. You could feel it in the way everyone moved around it, like they were handling something that could explode. The debris was taken to what base personnel called the vault, a secure storage facility that officially didn't exist on any organizational chart. Only a handful of scientists and engineers were granted access, and even they worked under the most restrictive security protocols. We all signed additional secrecy agreements, Exxon recalled. Papers that made it clear this was beyond top secret. This was compartmentalized in a way I'd never seen before. The general's description of the material matched accounts from Roswell witnesses, metallic fragments that seemed to defy the laws of physics, I-beams with hieroglyphic markings, foil-like material that couldn't be torn or burned. But according to Exxon, the most significant discoveries weren't made immediately. The real breakthroughs came months later, as military scientists began to understand what they were dealing with. The material wasn't just unusual, he said. It was impossible. At least, impossible according to anything we knew about metallurgy and engineering in 1947. Laboratory analysis revealed properties that wouldn't be achieved by human technology for decades. The metallic fragments showed evidence of atomic-level engineering, structures so precisely manufactured that they seemed grown rather than assembled. The foil-like material demonstrated what scientists would later term memory metal characteristics, returning to its original shape regardless of how it was deformed. Most intriguing were the I-beams with their hieroglyphic markings. Under microscopic examination, the symbols appeared to have been etched at the molecular level, integrated into the material's structure rather than simply printed on its surface. We had linguists look at the markings, Exxon said. Military intelligence brought in experts from universities, specialists in ancient languages and symbol systems. Nobody could make sense of it. But the real shock came when researchers attempted to reverse engineer the manufacturing processes. We couldn't even scratch the stuff, let alone figure out how it was made, Exxon recalled. It was like giving a computer to someone from the 1800s and asking them to build another one. The technology gap was just too vast. The general's account took a darker turn when he described the human elements of the story. There were bodies, he said, his voice becoming even quieter. Not from the crash site, those were too damaged by the elements, but preserved specimens that came later, from other incidents. According to Exxon, the Roswell crash was not an isolated event. Throughout the late 1940s and early 1950s, Wright-Patterson received materials and occasionally biological specimens from similar incidents across the American Southwest. Most of the crashes were in remote areas, he said, desert locations where the military could control access and manage the recovery. Roswell just happened to be the one that got public attention. The biological specimens, Exxon claimed, were housed in a separate facility, a laboratory complex that was built specifically for this purpose. The work conducted there involved some of the most advanced medical and scientific minds in the country. What they found challenged everything we thought we knew about biology, he said. The anatomical structure was humanoid, but clearly not human. The physiology was elegant, I suppose you could say, highly advanced. Dr. E. Randall pressed for more specific details, but Exxon's strength was fading. The conversation continued in fragments over several days, with the general sharing what he could during his more lucid moments. One revelation particularly disturbed the researchers. According to Exxon, the knowledge gained from studying the Roswell materials had been shared with a select group of aerospace companies and defense contractors. Not everything, he said. Just enough to push certain technologies forward. Fiber optics, integrated circuits, materials science advances that seemed to come from nowhere. The implication was staggering that major technological developments of the latter half of the 20th century had been influenced, at least in part, by the reverse engineering of extraterrestrial technology. Look at the timeline, Exxon suggested weakly. Look at how quickly certain breakthroughs happened after 1947. Transistors, lasers, computer chips, technologies that represented quantum leaps forward, often developed by companies that had Defense Department contracts. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of Exxon's confession concerned the ongoing secrecy. It wasn't just about national security, he said, though that was part of it. It was about control, about maintaining the established order. The implications of what we found were too massive, too disruptive. Religious institutions, governments, entire worldviews would have collapsed overnight. According to Exxon, a decision was made at the highest levels of government, possibly involving President Truman himself, that the truth about extraterrestrial contact would be managed by a small, compartmentalized group of military and civilian leaders. The public couldn't handle it, he said. Not in 1947, maybe not ever. So the knowledge became selective, shared only with those who had an operational need to know. As the general's condition deteriorated, his revelations became more fragmented but no less disturbing. He spoke of underground facilities where the research continued in absolute secrecy. He mentioned code names and project designations that the investigators had never heard before. And then, in his final conscious moments before slipping into a coma that would last until his death, Exxon delivered his most haunting statement. We learned things that changed everything we thought we knew about reality itself. But the cost of that knowledge was our humanity. We became guardians of a truth too dangerous to share, caretakers of secrets that isolated us from the very people we swore to protect. The general died 3 days later, taking with him decades of classified memories and unanswered questions. Dr. Randall and his colleagues were left to wrestle with the implications of what they had heard. Could they verify Exxon's claims? Were there other witnesses who could corroborate his account? And perhaps most importantly, was the truth still buried somewhere in the depths of Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, waiting for someone with the courage to bring it to light? The general's confession added another layer to the Roswell mystery. But like so many aspects of the story, it raised more questions than it answered. Truth and fiction, memory and mythology became increasingly difficult to separate as the decades passed and witnesses died. But in the quiet moments before sleep, when the desert wind whispers across New Mexico and the stars shine with ancient light, one question persists above all others. If Exxon's deathbed confession was genuine, what other secrets lie buried in the classified archives of the American military establishment? What other truths are considered too dangerous for public consumption? The answers, if they exist, remain locked away in facilities that officially don't exist, guarded by oaths of secrecy that extend beyond the grave. Chapter 7. The Files They Don't Want Found. Deep within the labyrinthine corridors of the National Security Agency, in a sub-basement that doesn't appear on any architectural blueprint, sits a filing cabinet that officially doesn't exist. The documents it contains are classified at levels beyond top secret, compartmentalized information that fewer than a dozen people in the world are authorized to access. These are the Roswell files that have never seen daylight. The story of their discovery begins with a mid-level NSA analyst named Sarah Chen, whose security clearance and computer expertise had granted her access to classified databases spanning 7 decades of intelligence operations. In 2019, while conducting routine data migration from obsolete storage systems, Chen stumbled upon a directory that shouldn't have been there. The file path was innocuous enough. Archives, historical, weather, 1947 NM, MISC. But the contents were extraordinary. Hidden within what appeared to be routine meteorological data were documents that painted a picture of the Roswell incident unlike anything in the public record. These weren't the sanitized reports that had been selectively declassified over the decades. These were the raw, unedited files from the military units that had actually handled the incident. Chen's hands trembled as she opened the first document, a field report from Major Jesse Marcel, dated July 8, 1947. But this wasn't the carefully worded official statement that had become part of the historical record. This was Marcel's initial unfiltered assessment of what he had found in the desert. Material exhibits properties inconsistent with known terrestrial technology, Marcel had written. Structural composition appears to involve atomic-level engineering beyond current human capability. Recommend immediate sequestration under highest classification protocols. The report continued with technical specifications that read like science fiction. Materials analysis, results that defied the laws of physics, metallurgical properties that wouldn't be achieved by human science for decades to come. But the Marcel report was just the beginning. Chen discovered correspondence between Wright-Patterson Air Force Base and the Pentagon that revealed the scope of the cover-up operation. Project Blue Paper, as it was codenamed, involved the systematic suppression of all evidence related to the Roswell incident. The operation had multiple components. Media manipulation. Press releases were carefully crafted to ridicule UFO sightings and promote conventional explanations for unusual phenomena. Journalists who pursued the story too aggressively found their careers mysteriously stalled. Witness management. Military personnel with direct knowledge of the incident were transferred to remote assignments or encouraged to accept early retirement with enhanced benefits. Civilian witnesses faced more subtle pressures: tax audits, employment difficulties, social ostracism, evidence control. All physical materials from the crash were consolidated at Wright-Patterson and subjected to intensive analysis by teams of scientists working under the most restrictive security protocols. But perhaps most disturbing was a document dated September 24, 1947, a memorandum from President Harry Truman to Defense Secretary James Forrestal that confirmed the existence of an extraterrestrial craft and its occupants. The implications of this discovery extend far beyond military considerations, Truman had written. We are dealing with technologies and intelligences that could fundamentally alter the balance of world power. This information must be managed with extreme discretion to prevent social and economic disruption. The memo went on to establish what would become known as Majestic 12, a secret committee of military leaders, scientists, and government officials tasked with managing all aspects of extraterrestrial contact. Chen printed the document with shaking hands, hardly believing what she was reading. This wasn't conspiracy theory speculation. This was official government correspondence from the President of the United States, acknowledging the reality of alien contact and authorizing its cover-up. But as she continued digging through the files, Chen discovered something that chilled her to the bone. Project Blue Paper wasn't just about covering up the Roswell incident. It was an ongoing operation that had been active for over 7 decades. The files contained reports of subsequent crashes, recoveries, and contacts spanning from 1947 to the present day. Site designation NM2 in 1948, AZ-7 in 1953, TX-14 in 1965. Each incident followed the same pattern: military recovery, media suppression, witness management. Each crash site yielded additional materials and, occasionally, surviving occupants. The biological specimens were housed at a facility identified only as cold storage, a location that Chen's security clearance wasn't sufficient to access. But the research reports she could review painted a picture of systematic study and, eventually, limited communication with extraterrestrial entities. Project Looking Glass, initiated in 1964, involved attempts to establish dialogue with recovered alien survivors. The transcripts Chen discovered were fragmentary but extraordinary. Conversations that touched on technology, philosophy, and the broader context of Earth's place in a populated galaxy. "Your species stands at a critical juncture," read one translated exchange. "The choices made in the coming decades will determine whether humanity joins the galactic community or faces extinction through its own technological immaturity." The implications were staggering. Not only was the government aware of extraterrestrial intelligence, it had been engaged in ongoing communication for decades. But Chen's unauthorized access to the files hadn't gone unnoticed. On March 15, 2019, she arrived at work to find her security clearance had been suspended pending a routine review. Her computer access was revoked. Her supervisor informed her that she was being transferred to a different department, one that dealt with mundane administrative tasks rather than classified intelligence. The message was clear. Some files were too sensitive even for authorized personnel. Chen attempted to contact journalists, researchers, anyone who might be interested in what she had discovered. But the documents she had printed were confiscated during a security inspection of her personal belongings. The digital copies had been automatically deleted by fail-safe programs built into the classified computer systems. Within 6 months, Chen had left the NSA entirely, accepting a generous early retirement package that came with comprehensive non-disclosure agreements and periodic wellness checks by agency personnel. She now lives quietly in a small town in Montana, working as a freelance computer consultant. She rarely speaks about her former career, and when pressed about her time at the NSA, she simply says that some knowledge is too dangerous to share. But sometimes, on clear nights when the stars are particularly bright, she stands in her backyard and stares up at the cosmos with a mixture of wonder and fear. She knows we are not alone. She knows our government has been in contact with alien intelligences for decades. She knows that technologies beyond our current understanding are locked away in classified facilities, being slowly reverse-engineered and selectively introduced into human society. And she knows that this knowledge, the most significant discovery in human history, remains hidden behind walls of secrecy that extend far beyond any single administration or political party. The truth about Roswell isn't just about what crashed in the desert in 1947. It's about an ongoing relationship between humanity and extraterrestrial intelligence that has been managed in absolute secrecy for over 70 years. The files Chen discovered paint a picture of a world where first contact has already occurred, where alien technology is being studied and adapted, where the future of human civilization is being shaped by knowledge that the public is deemed too unprepared to handle. Whether that knowledge will ever see the light of day, whether humanity will ever learn the full truth about its place in the cosmic community, remains an open question. But the files exist, hidden in digital archives and physical vaults scattered across the intelligence community, protected by security protocols that treat the information as more sensitive than nuclear weapons. The truth is out there, locked away behind classifications that may never expire, guarded by oaths of secrecy that extend beyond the grave. And somewhere in the New Mexico desert, the wind still whispers across the crash site where it all began, carrying secrets that could change the world, if anyone had the courage to listen. Chapter 8. The Truth That Sleeps with the Stars. The summer of 2024 brought something unprecedented to Washington, D.C. For the first time in nearly 8 decades, members of Congress were demanding answers about UFOs, or UAPs, as they're now officially designated. Unidentified aerial phenomena. The language had changed, but the questions remained the same. In a secure briefing room deep beneath the Pentagon, a small group of senators and representatives gathered for what would be remembered as the most significant intelligence briefing since the Cuban Missile Crisis. The information they received that day would forever change their understanding of humanity's place in the universe. The briefing officer was a career intelligence analyst whose name will never appear in public records. For the purposes of this account, we'll call him David Warren. His security clearance was among the highest in the government, granting him access to programs that most Pentagon officials didn't know existed. Warren began with a simple statement that sent shockwaves through the assembled lawmakers. Ladies and gentlemen, we are not alone in this universe. We never have been, and our government has known this fact for 77 years. The PowerPoint presentation that followed was unlike anything in the history of congressional briefings. Photographs of metallic debris that defied known physics. Video footage of craft performing maneuvers that would be lethal to human pilots. Medical examination reports of beings that were clearly not of earthly origin. And through it all, the thread that connected everything back to a ranch in New Mexico, where it all began. The Roswell incident was not a weather balloon, Warren told the stunned legislators. It was a reconnaissance craft of extraterrestrial origin that suffered a catastrophic failure during what we believe was a routine monitoring mission. The craft, according to classified analysis, had been observing humanity's rapid technological development in the aftermath of World War II. The atomic bombs dropped on Japan had apparently served as a signal to watching intelligences that Earth's inhabitants had entered a new and potentially dangerous phase of development. Nuclear weapons represent a threshold technology, Warren explained. Every civilization that develops them faces the same choice: learn to control these forces or face extinction. The extraterrestrial monitoring increased dramatically after 1945. The Roswell crash wasn't an invasion or an accident. It was a surveillance mission gone wrong. The occupants of the craft were biological entities, but not in any conventional sense. They were artificially created beings, designed specifically for reconnaissance and data gathering. Think of them as organic drones, Warren said. Highly sophisticated, capable of independent thought and action, but created for a specific purpose. They were never intended for direct contact with human populations. The recovery and study of these entities had provided insights into biotechnology and genetic engineering that wouldn't have been achieved by human science for centuries. Many of the medical and technological advances of the late 20th century had been influenced, at least partially, by knowledge gained from the Roswell materials. But the most significant revelation concerned ongoing contact. The crash wasn't an isolated incident, Warren continued. It was the beginning of a managed relationship that continues to this day. According to the classified files, representatives of the extraterrestrial civilization had established formal contact with the U.S. government in 1954. President Eisenhower had been briefed on the situation and had authorized limited cooperation under the strictest security protocols. The arrangement was simple. The extraterrestrials would share selected technological knowledge in exchange for permission to conduct limited studies of human development. The studies were benign: biological sampling, psychological profiling, sociological observation. They're anthropologists, Warren explained. We're an emerging civilization that has reached a critical developmental stage. They're documenting our progress for reasons we don't fully understand. The technology transfers had been carefully managed to avoid disrupting human society. Advances in computing, material science, and medical technology were introduced gradually, often through defense contractors and research institutions that were unwittingly participating in the program. Integrated circuits, fiber optics, stealth technology, magnetic resonance imaging, these represent just a fraction of the knowledge that's been selectively shared over the decades, Warren said. But the relationship came with restrictions. Humanity was considered too immature for direct contact. The social, religious, and political disruptions would be too severe. The knowledge was shared only with a small group of military and civilian leaders who could manage its introduction into human society. The decision was made that humanity needed to evolve gradually into this new reality, Warren explained. Sudden disclosure would cause more harm than good. The assembled lawmakers struggled to process what they were hearing. Senator Patricia Williams of Nevada finally asked the question that everyone was thinking. How many people know about this? Warren's answer was sobering. Fewer than 50 individuals worldwide have complete knowledge of the program. Perhaps 200 more have partial access to specific aspects. The compartmentalization is absolute. The briefing continued for 6 hours, covering everything from underground facilities where the research was conducted to the sophisticated psychological operations designed to discredit UFO researchers and witnesses. The scope of the cover-up was breathtaking. A multi-generational conspiracy involving thousands of participants, most of whom were unaware of their role in the larger operation. But as the briefing concluded, Warren delivered one final piece of information that would haunt the lawmakers for the rest of their lives. The extraterrestrials have indicated that humanity is approaching another threshold. Climate change, artificial intelligence, genetic engineering, space travel. We're developing capabilities that could affect not just our own world, but the broader galactic community. According to the intelligence reports, humanity had perhaps 2 decades to prove its maturity as a species. The choices made during this period would determine whether Earth would be welcomed into the galactic community or quarantined to prevent it from becoming a threat to other civilizations. The disclosure process has already begun, Warren said. Military acknowledgement of UAP encounters, gradual release of previously classified footage, congressional hearings like this one, All of this is part of a carefully orchestrated program to prepare humanity for a larger truth. The plan was to achieve full disclosure by 2045, assuming humanity demonstrated sufficient stability and maturity. If not, the isolation would continue indefinitely. As the lawmakers filed out of the briefing room, they carried with them knowledge that would forever change their perspective on humanity's future. They had learned that the greatest secret in human history was not about the past, but about what was yet to come. The truth about Roswell was just the beginning of a story that was still being written. And somewhere in the vast New Mexico desert, where it all started on a summer night in 1947, the stars continue to shine with their ancient light, keeping watch over a world that stands on the threshold between childhood and maturity, between isolation and cosmic citizenship. The choice, as it always has been, belongs to humanity itself. But now, at least, a few more people understand the true nature of that choice, and the cosmic consequences that hang in the balance. As you drift off to sleep tonight, remember that above your head, beyond the thin shell of atmosphere that protects our fragile world, vast intelligences are watching and waiting to see what we will become. The universe is patient, but it is not infinite in its patience. And the clock that began ticking in the summer of 1947 continues its steady countdown toward a future that will be determined by the choices we make today. Sleep well, knowing that in the morning the stars will still be there, keeping their ancient vigil over the children of Earth who are finally, slowly, learning that they are not alone. The truth sleeps with the stars, and someday soon, it may finally wake up.